Hello, my name is Chris Richter, and I had a question about Moodle development, and in this case it was a question about drop-down lists in forms. And the issue that someone had was they have a drop-down list and they'd like that drop-down list to dynamically load content from the database depending on what item is selected in the first drop-down. So I'm going to show you how I went about doing that so that it works, and it has to use Ajax as part of it as well. So I'll take you step by step and show you how that actually works and how to do it. So we go to courses. In here what I've done, I've created a local plugin called Ajax Demo. You can see that I've gone to local and Ajax Demo. I've also created a drop-down list in a form, and that drop-down list grabs a list of the two courses that I have on this particular server. I've only got two, and the idea is that when I choose one of those courses, it will then go and find the teachers that match that course, and it will do that without reloading the page. So if I choose courses and I go to Ricoshae 3.9, it actually hasn't done anything, and the reason for that is that that particular course doesn't have any teachers. If I go to test course 1, it runs off to the server and it grabs teacher, a test teacher that I have in there for that course. At the moment when you hit save, it doesn't actually do anything, but obviously you would want to save the value of either the course and the teacher or the course ID and the teacher ID, but that's up to you. Okay, let's have a look at how that actually works in the code. So in the code, I have Ajax Demo is the plugin that I created, so that's just got its own version, and I created an index file for that as well. And I'll start with the index and I'll work my way through each of the steps that are involved. So for the index file, it really just loads in the config and the DB user in case we need any of that. It also requires the forms Ajax demo form. So that's the form that we have over here on the left. So that's the form that we will use in this page. I've also set a page URL for it and context. And the most important part, or one of the most important parts, I have included the JavaScript that we will use to make this happen. So in Ajax Demo Assets.js, Ajax Demo.js, you can see that file is over here. So that's included in this page. Two things I've put in there is to get the ID, which is probably not needed at the moment, and also delete function. This is in case you are using this as a form where you are updating existing data, or you are deleting a record as well using the one form. So you may not need any of that. I've just put in a title and a heading, and this is the function. If someone chose delete, then we need to do the relative applicable delete function. mForm is where we grab the Ajax demo form. So that was the form that we included up here, the require once Ajax demo form. This is where we actually create the form. And toForm is just the information that came from the form if it's being posted. So everything else under here, all of this information below here is related to what happens when somebody sends that form or posts that form to the page. So we don't need to worry too much about that because we're not dealing with that part of it. But if we go down here to the form part here, you'll say mForm set data. Again, if we're posting a form or we are loading data from a table that belongs to a form, then that's where we'd do this part. Then the last bit is to display the form. So after that, that's all we needed or had to do for that bit of it. So the first thing then was the actual form itself. So this is our form. This is my Ajax demo form. In the form, all I've done is set up a definition for the form to put in the fields we need. I've grabbed from the database a list of all of the courses. So that's our record there of all the courses from the database. What I've had to do here is set the options that go with the select. So this is the course select. You can see options over here is where we've got the options, or the list of options that really are the IDs and the name of the course. So what I do is I grab all of the courses, I loop through them, and using the options array, I'm just putting in the course ID and the course full name. And what that does is the course ID puts in the value for the select, and the course full name puts in the actual name that appears as the the text for the select, or for the drop-down list. So that's our first drop-down list. Our second drop-down list that we have is options, and for it, all we've got is select, and this is a list of teachers. So the options don't have anything in them when you first go into the page. Because they haven't selected anything yet, we don't know what the value of this one is yet. We can set this one for the second drop-down list as just options with nothing in it. And then we have the usual button array to put all the buttons in for the form, and our validation, which we don't use at the moment. What happens first is, remember back in our index file, we loaded our JavaScript Ajax demo.js. If we go into our JavaScript Ajax demo.js file, our JavaScript file, I've loaded in our core jQuery UI, which is not needed, but the important one is core Ajax. Well, the important two is jQuery and the core Ajax, because we're going to use Ajax. We now have our jQuery. And from here, what we're doing is adding to ID courses. And where did ID courses come from? When you create an Ajax form, when you create, not an Ajax form, when you create a Moodle form, it uses the ID here. When you add an element, it uses this name and puts ID underscore in front of it to give an ID for that particular element. So if we go back to our Ajax demo, we've got ID courses, which matches in our form, courses just here. That gives us ID courses. What I'm doing is saying that when that particular drop-down list changes, when that value changes, run this function. What this function does is gets the ID that they selected. Gets the ID number or the value of that drop-down list. So ID courses, gets the value, which is the course ID. Then we go off and we call Ajax. And for Ajax, we're calling a method called local Ajax demo get teachers in course, which is actually a service that I created, and I'll show you how I created that service in a moment. As one of the arguments, I'm sending the ID, which is the selected course ID. That's being sent to the Ajax call, goes off back to the server basically, and finds the teachers in a course using the course ID. When that returns, I clean out any of the values that were in the teachers drop-down list, because if it's changed, obviously we've got to get rid of everything that's there. Then I pass the JSON that came back in the response here, that came back to our Ajax call. I then loop through all of that and I create a whole set of new options. So the options will have a value of ID for each of the teachers. So we've got the teacher ID. That means if you want to save that somewhere, when they save the form, then you can send the ID back for the teacher field. We also have then inside the HTML, we have their first name and last name, and we append that to ID teachers, which is our second drop-down list. Obviously, if that fails, then I'll just have it logging an error here, but you'll need to do something with that when it fails. So we've got the JavaScript part working now. So the JavaScript, if I go back to our form here, you can see what it's doing is I'm adding a onChange JavaScript function. So when this changes, JavaScript will then follow that change. It will run off to the server and call this particular task that we're going to show you how that's set up in a moment. It will call that in Moodle, and then it will come back and populate the teachers drop down. And that will give us our teacher with the teacher as the teacher's name and their ID as the value of that drop down list. So back again to the last part, and the last part was this method name and the Ajax call. To set that up, we need to set up a service. So I've put that in DB and services, and I've set up a service here called local Ajax demo get teachers in course. And if you look back in our JavaScript, local Ajax demo get teachers in course is our method, and there is our service there, our service function, and the class that we're using is local Ajax demo in external. I'll show you where that comes into in a minute. Our method is get teachers in course, and if you go back to here, when you call that method, local Ajax demo get teachers in course, that calls this service. And the important parts of this service are the class path So local Ajax demo external lib. So we're going to look at that external lib file in a moment, which is just here. And the login is required is true, and Ajax is true. So we're not using it as a service, as in web services. We're only using it as an Ajax service for Ajax. So that means that we'll send a token with it to make sure that it's valid and the person's allowed to actually make that call. So the last part then is the method itself, and that's in external lib. So let's go to external lib. In external lib, just here, we have our class is local Ajax demo external, which, just to double check, our class name, local Ajax demo external matches. So that's good. We're in external lib. And there's 3 parts to this. So our get teachers in course parameters, that's where we grab the ID that Ajax sent over. And that ID comes from the JavaScript here. That's that argument ID just here. So that gets sent to that method. And back in here, we've now got the method. We've got the value that comes in for the get teachers in course. We also have a function called get teachers in course that uses ID, and that gets the ID from here. Inside that function, I've left some of those other bits out, but the important part is we've grabbed the ID parameter and we've validated that. So if you need to go down and validate any of the get teachers in course parameters, that validation there actually calls this function and just validates to make sure it is an integer and it comes from ID. What we then do is, in our case, we need to check what role, we need to get the ID for the role, the editing teacher, or our teacher. We need to get the context for the course. So this is course context. We can then get the get role users with the role ID of whatever the editing teacher role ID is in the context of the course that was selected from the drop-down list. That puts it into teachers, and then we return that JSON encoded array values teachers. We return teachers as a JSON, as JSON data, back to our page, and that goes back into our JavaScript, and then we can then put that inside the drop-down list. So hope you're following all that still. So from here, that return value goes back to our jQuery. It comes back in our response. That value was JSON, so we need to pass that JSON, and then we loop through it and we add our new options to the second drop-down list, and we are completely done. And that's how you do it. Hope that's been helpful. If there's other things you need or you're looking for, let me know. And otherwise, there's some courses that I've got as well on how to do some of this and even how to create your own plugin. Hope that's been helpful. I'll talk soon.